Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Deregulation. That means getting the government's nose out of whatever the nose is into. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to talk about deregulation of the airline industry, how the government got in and why it's getting out. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Our panelists today are Bill Mosier from the Ball State University Marketing Department, J.B. Black, Professor of Finance at Ball State, and John Rouse from the Political Science faculty. Bill, why did the government get involved in regulation of the airline industry to begin with?
Basically, Larry, the whole idea, if you go back into the late 1800s, you had transportation such as the railroads, and you had a tremendous amount of effect upon development, upon commerce, and this sort of thing, where you got in a situation where you had a tremendously intensively competitive situation. And it is recognized that the railroads were essential for the development when the nation was developing westward and this sort of thing. But you had a situation where the customers, you and I, as individuals, were then vulnerable to that. If you had someone who wanted to control our life, if they were the one that had a monopoly in our area without any kind of constraint on how they operated, then we'd be tremendously affected. In other words, they could, if they had a monopoly there, they could hold us up, so to speak. They could take advantage of the situation. So if you look at it from 1887, when the railroads, when you had the Interstate Commerce Commission Act passed, and the railroads were the ones that were affected at that time, down through the years, you move through the 30s is when you start having the other modes. For example, 35 was the Motor Carrier Act, which was basically all subsequent acts were then amendments to or modeled on the original Railroad ICC Act. What actually happened then, you had in the late 30s, you had air transport that was regulated in the same way. But the real interest was to provide some sort of a control, some sort of a mechanism where you could have safety and an assurance of availability. And it really meant that you then, as an operator, had a responsibility to provide a certain amount of assurance of that. In other words, you would get an assured territory, you would get a certain amount of assurance that you would have that opportunity to operate. You would literally have to file a certificate of public convenience. So in return for you having that assurance of being able to go into business there and be a transportation operator, you had to agree to be available, stay in business, and literally the government could force you to, at that time, stay in business even though you were bankrupt. They literally were monitoring the books tremendously closely, and it was a very tight bureaucratic sort of a process as a result of that.
When did it become unnecessary for the government to regulate, or why?
Well, Larry, I think it's a question that ever since the evolution was something that that people, observers, have different opinions. It's a very, very volatile issue. But when we started seeing in the 70s, late 70s, mid to late 70s, you started seeing more and more recognition by the way the people were voting, this sort of thing, that we wanted less regulation. And so it forced some of the people involved to take a closer, harder look at that whole idea of whether there was a need for it. I don't know that I would say that there was absolutely less need for it. There's more willingness to look at the alternatives. And there were some real problems with the way it was being regulated at that time.
One of the things in the field of utilities, and including the railroad, you had the problem. I mean, a utility, electric company has fixed wires, lines. The railroads have tracks that are not easily changed from one position to another. The airline industry, though, on the other hand, is a little different there. And to break away from regulation, it was entirely possible to do it with the airlines, where it had really not been very feasible to do it with either any of the other public utility lines where fixed lines were involved. Without regulation of public utilities, for example, let's take electric companies alone, if everybody who wanted to sell electricity was permitted to go out and put it up, we would have nothing but a mishmash of wires all across the country. In fact, early telephone systems proved that. There were telephone companies, maybe as many as 5, 10, 15 telephone companies, each one stringing up their own wires. The airline's a little different there. Now, the airline requires a place to land, but in the air, why, it's they're all even. I think this was a factor in the deregulation. The airline was something that could be deregulated much more easily than some of the others.
Much the same way they look at deregulating radio television industry, and that you're actually regulating the airways or the airspace in this case.
But the airspace is not unlike the airlines. I mean, it's not as rigid.
Of course, the whole thing, we had this thinking was available, or people started raising the questions. We also, I think, had more people who were, once the airlines, this idea is raised, then you had people who were financially interested in investing, and they saw this as a business opportunity. So you had the potential of, with the idea that there could be deregulation, there were people that were suddenly interested, investors that were interested in it. They may never have looked at the air industry. In other words, people who had capital, they were looking at, where do I invest it? Do I invest in industry? Do I invest in manufacturing? Do I invest it in different parts of our society or different parts of our industry and commerce and this sort of thing? But I think once the issue was raised of deregulation, then that probably brought capital to that area, and you had probably more potential different players in that.
Well, that's certainly true. Of course, another constraint here is the safety factor. In other words, if we go back and look at the regulation of the rail, as to draw an analogy, sure, there were safety problems and so on, but not nearly as intricate as they are in the airlines. And of course, as the air regulation of routes and prices and rates and so on, also came the regulation of airlines in terms of safety. We were talking just before we went on the air about probably as many as 40% or perhaps, I would think more, of the public are now using the airlines. That means an awful lot of people are involved. It's not just the safety of the employees, but the safety of our whole country as far as that's concerned. This is somewhat in conflict with, if we take strictly the economics, who can build a better mousetrap, who can put more miles for the buck, that's one thing. But if in lowering the rates and lowering costs, if we lower maintenance standards or reduce something there, then we've got a whole different set of problems. And this is something that
I think we also have to look at the politics of this, and as both of you have said, it's really the politics of consumerism. The fact that we have at least 40% of the American public does fly on a frequent basis. Now, if we look at the political bureaucracy of all this, we can look at three basic political bureaucracies. Of course, in 1938, you had the Civil Aeronautics Board established. And it was called the CAB, and until 1978, the CAB had the control of approving airlines and also routes. And that was a tremendous influence in terms of a political bureaucracy that was appointed by the president, I believe, for 7-year terms, and then, of course, approved by Congress.
A lot of clout.
And then also about 1958, you had the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA as it's known today, and of course it does have a great deal of influence in terms of the safety focus. The FAA was established at that time. And then the NTSB. The NTSB is the organization, the National Transportation Safety Board, goes into Los Angeles where there was a horrible crash just several days ago, and it picks up the pieces of the plane. It tries to figure out what happened. So with the politics of it, you don't want the fox checking the hen house, so you don't want the FAA going out to find out why the plane crashed. So in this illustration, you have to be careful with the foxes and the hens and so forth, because we know what foxes do to hens, and that is that they will somehow taint the investigation, and so you have the NTSB doing all the investigations. So the bureaucracy of it all is to have a check and balance.
How does deregulation then affect this system with the FAA, the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board?
Well, I think the thing that happened was we had deregulation very widely, other than the safety. The safety is the one thing that was not nearly as deregulated with deregulation. In other words, the CAB was the one that watched over it financially, the industry. They watched over the management, the competitiveness, the health of the industry, things of this nature. But the safety thing is something that to this date is very much regulated, and there is a question whether it should be even more regulated and more maintained. The FAA has, I believe it's like 1,800 individuals that are their investigators and their inspectors that check, and they expect in the next 3 years to increase that by 500 more. They are very aggressive. Whether they are completely right in the way they do it is another question, but there is no question that they are coming down on some of the existing operators in terms of safety, maintenance and safety.
Well, that's true, but getting back to John's fox in the hen house, we've got a situation where just a few years ago, we fired all of the air controllers in the United States because of a union problem, which we should get to here in a minute. And this definitely had safety consequences on the thing. Now, in the tragic air loss that we had just this past weekend, they're now coming on with the fact that the air controllers who were involved, presumably there's a question of drug testing and so on that's entering in here. And from what we hear in the media, it's very confusing. If the air controllers will promise that they will go and send no more, they're going to let them continue running. But if they won't promise that and take a drug program and so on, why we're going to have another firing, and they're about 50-50 as to who's on first.
And of course, this gets back to politics, because you have here issues of basic freedoms. I mean, does a person have a right to take a drug and also have the same job? Does a person have a right to purchase an airplane and go flying off in any direction that he or she wants to fly, whether they're sober or not? Because we've also heard that sometimes folks get in their little private airplanes and drink, and of course that's another kind of drug in a sense.
Yes.
But the issue of personal freedom, in terms of the air traffic controllers, in terms of drug substance, and also in terms of the people who buy the private planes and want to fly. So we do have a real political problem here.
But that's why government gets in the business of regulation in the first place, isn't it? To protect the public from people who might do things that would injure the public.
Well, the theory, of course, here is that when competition cannot regulate or control, whether it be price or routes or safety or whatever it may be, that the role of government is to step in and on behalf of all of us. I don't think we should take a position that government is bad per se. We went at the bureaucratic portion of this thing pretty heavy, but on the other hand, there's a lot of very finely dedicated people that have been involved in this, and from the safety aspects, I certainly hope that they're dedicated.
Yeah, if I could pick up on JB's point about the air traffic controllers, it was the PETCO, it was called, the Professional Air Controllers Organization. It, of course, was a union until 1981, and then in a sense President Reagan made a point out of this union, and he did in a sense bust this union, and it does not exist anymore. I think the sad thing here is that a lot of good qualified people lost their jobs, and therefore those of us who fly, those of us who are the consumer, we also lose. And if we look at the celebration this past week of the September 1st, I believe was Labor Day, the focus upon the relationship between labor and management, and how it seems that in this case management won, but labor lost. In a sense, the people also lost, the flying public also lost. And the issue as we look at labor-management relations in this country, how can both labor win and also management win and the consumer win? And that's the big question, of course.
Well, you know, in the last just very few years, I'd say the last 10 years in particular, much progress has been made in that area. In other words, we're coming up with a concept now that it isn't a question of labor winning or management winning. It's a question of communication of labor and management working together, albeit still in an adversarial role. In other words, they're sitting on opposite sides of the table, but they're bringing informed, high-level, sophisticated techniques to the bargaining table, and we are coming up with something like that. In labor situation, if we had not done this, and with the advent of foreign competition in many fields, many of our industries would be completely gone. As it is, there are many that are suffering.
In other words, they both have a common adversary, the foreign competition.
That's right.
Well, we see that in the auto industry. I mean, we felt that in Indiana. How does this apply to the airline industry?
Well, I think it definitely, I don't know precisely, but it must have an effect because we are competing against foreign airlines. Very much.
And there's another point to that, and it's something that is very interesting. They just came out with the figures on the fact that the economy, as far as the number of orders, was up substantially. But one of the reasons in the last month that orders for manufactured goods was up substantially was airlines from Korea, for example, buying from U.S. air manufacturers. In other words, it's substantial contracts that they got for equipment, for airplanes and this sort of thing. So if we have this situation where you're seeing that throughout industry, where you're seeing a lot more of that participative and cooperative management. Now, it's worked sometimes, and other times it has not. In other words, GM has an example at Saginaw that is working as a management labor partnership that's working exceedingly well. We look at the air industry, one of the classic cases, the one that looked great but fell apart in February of this year, was Eastern Airlines, because they had a trust and a relationship and a mutual working together. And they refused, I think it was, I don't know which one of the unions, refused to go along with cutbacks in wages. And as a result, this thing dissolved, and it was only formed, it was formed in '83, so it's only had 2-3 years of existence. But still, it is affecting airlines in terms of the equipment. It's also affecting in terms of the way that the airlines are managing, because you do have some of this filtering into. You're finding it in steel industry. That obviously affects, or any of your basic materials affects the airlines and that sort of thing in terms of their supply of their materials. So it's happening in a lot of our very large industries, or substantial industries, where you're really seeing this most evident and most prone to happen.
Larry, I'd also like to focus on the fact that one of the industries that this country still dominates in is the airline industry. And we got into it after World War II. Our main competitor in the world, of course, is the Airbus out of England and France. But for the most part, we've been very successful in this industry, and it is one that we have maintained an edge in. But I think getting back to the consumer issue, we have to ask the question, since deregulation, has the cost of a ticket gone down?
Oh, I think the cost of a ticket, without any question, overall has gone down. I think the figures support that. I don't think there's any question. You're going to find it'll be more varied because it will be more responsive or more in recognition of what the expenses are. In other words, it won't be something that will be standardized and a lot of subsidy that's going on between different passengers. You'll have areas, routes that are very, very rarely used, that it'll be very expensive. And you'll have the ones that'll be the cross-country routes and this sort of thing, that they'll be dirt cheap. Now, that's something sometimes can work, and People's Express is having some problems now, so it doesn't always work. It's not a guarantee that it's going to. In other words, they may get so close to that cutting edge that they cannot manage well enough to maintain that. So it's really a mixed bag on that.
Of course, one of the things too, if you're going to take advantage of the lower rates, and certainly they are lower now, but you've got to plan ahead. You've got to be 30 days ahead in your planning. Otherwise, you're going to pay what I think is seemingly a higher rate than it used to be. I don't know.
Well, now it's my understanding that if you want a short haul route, in other words, between Chicago and Muncie, or if we had one between Indianapolis and Muncie, it would cost a lot of money. It would cost you a lot more money than it did
undoubtedly.
Previously. In fact, there is no plane between Indianapolis and Muncie.
Because of that.
Yeah, because of that. Now, also that the traveler, the vacation traveler, does indeed fly cheaper because he or she does plan ahead. But if you're a business person, you're paying as much, if not more, because you're not coming in under that short-term duration of a week or so many days.
Now, you can't really, in business, you cannot plan ahead that
unless you have major, like if you're going to like a convention or maybe perhaps a training seminar, a lot of the retraining going on where you know it 6 months ahead that it's scheduled. But other than that, you're right, without any question.
Of course, a lot of your larger businesses have their own airlines, in the sense they have private industry planes that and there's no effect there whatsoever as far as costs are concerned.
what are the specifics of regulation? What real changes do we see when we move from the regulation of the airline industry to deregulation? What does the consumer notice? You mentioned some lower rates, some higher rates.
Well, I think the consumer also is very aware of the fact that you're going to have cutbacks in certain types of service. It won't be as standardized, where through competition, different ones will tailor their service they offer. And so you'll have things like People's Express with their, that really didn't exist when it was all very much fairly rigid. And so you have more of a mixture of the amount of, what is it they say, some of the ones like People's Express or some of the other ones that are gone in this direction. They'll have a no-frills thing, so you'll have some of these sorts of things. So I think that is a very evident impact. I think we talked just a few minutes ago about the fact that you're going to have certain locations that are not going to be as prone to be serviced. In other words, they're going to give up on routes, and you had a lot of duplication in the same routes of different ones that you don't have nearly as much now, where you really have to...
Are the feeder lines really being hurt more on this than the long-haul lines?
I think the feeder lines, from my understanding, would be they're being hurt where they really didn't have enough capital, that they didn't have enough of a margin to survive. The
feeder lines were growing before deregulation.
Well, JB, the term feeder, I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I'm talking about the kind of service that we would have here in Muncie.
Commuter
service.
The ones that
go to the major markets, Chicago, Indianapolis.
Feed in. Now, if you'll recall, just a few years ago, the local airline, if I wanted to fly to New York or to London or wherever it may be, for $2 extra, I could fly out of Muncie as opposed to going to Indianapolis or Dayton. And that's no longer, as far as I know, is no longer available. I can initiate a long flight from here, but there's no particular saving.
Well, what we've seen here then is greater competition, but for the major markets.
That's true.
People like Muncie are really being hurt by it.
Well, another thing, we were flying just recently, and from time to time they just cancel out whole flights, where before they couldn't do that unless there was a matter of safety or something of that sort. But now, if the economics of the flight isn't going to pay off, they're canceling flights, and this creates a lot of havoc.
Which really gets at the heart of what the original regulation was all about. You wanted absolute assurance that you were going to have service that was very broadly available and this sort of thing. Literally, what is happening is if you're going on the long routes in the past, you were subsidizing the ones to the smaller communities because they weren't as economically justified. And as a result, you had a situation where and it's very much parallel. JB mentioned about the telephone industry. Very much parallel. It's the same thing. That you have that subsidy of long distance versus local. It's a very similar situation. So it's really thrown to more of a user fee type approach to the whole thing. But it also means it's going to be more volatile, less predictable. You have all these things where it's not as protected and that sort of thing.
Well, Bill, the word predictability brings to the issue of safety. I had a couple of colleagues who were flying to Washington, D.C. last week, and they saw a small plane right underneath them, and they were very exercised, so to speak, by this small plane. And the safety is a thing that is very much in the public's mind, especially with 40% flying. Do you believe that the safety has increased or decreased since deregulation?
Well, again, I have to say it's a mixed bag. For example, safety was very good from 77 through 84. 85 was the worst year that we've had since that time. Now, this year was very good until the bad crash that we had in the Los Angeles area. And so, again, I think you see a situation where they were really feeling great because up until 84, through 84 it looked great, and then 85 was a terrible year. It was the worst year in a long time. And so that makes you take stock and say, wait a minute, were we just lucky? Was it not because we did a good job of regulating? What has happened? What's this change? And so it's really, again, unpredictability to a certain degree, because I think you've got changing management, changing pressures, and the FAA right now is going after some of these major airlines with significant millions of dollars in fines that they have successfully levied, over $4 million in a 20-month period. So there's a question of the maintenance being the way that it really should be. Now, a lot of them Eastern included, have been successfully fighting, say, whoa, wait a minute. You took it out of context. It wasn't as bad as you are implying by these samplings and this sort of thing. So it gets into a question of how you effectively regulate it, assure that it's being accomplished without it being excessively expensive. There's a difficult juggling act that's involved there.
Is regulation like politics and the politics of regulation, is it cyclical? Are we going to see perhaps a return at some point toward more government regulation if in fact the consumer is inconvenienced by not having the flights they want, inconvenienced or endangered by safety, or are we at a point where the airline industry is deregulated for?
Well, fortunately in this country, I believe that in the long run that you and I as individuals are going to have our impact, and I think that the public becomes disenchanted with what's going on, then we're going to see a move backwards or in some other direction. And the public is got to be satisfied here. And here with I still think your 40% of people using is a low figure, but with 40%, that's a huge segment of the population. And if this group becomes dissatisfied, there's a lot of political pressure there that can be brought to bear, and I think that we're going to demand that safety be number one priority. And then I think that the inconveniences and other things that may arise that we're going to.
But it probably wasn't all bad that we had the deregulation just to force it to take stock. In other words, I think the regulation had evolved and had become really lethargic and very bureaucratic. And so I think it needed to be, that it needed some shaking up just to evaluate what we really did need and what was just there because it had evolved that way.
Well, let's shaking things up. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I think that the politics will become more intense. Anytime you see on television a plane turning belly up with 65 people going to their deaths, that's a very emotional kind of experience.
We're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists, J.B. Black, Bill Mosher, and John Rouse for the commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosher. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.